Chapter 17 Grand Portage. By the time Charbonneau's crew finished unloading, the rest of the brigade had tapped a brandy keg. "If you don't care to pickle your brain," Charbonneau offered, "I'll show you the grounds." They walked beyond the stockade at the encampment. Pierre was surprised to see two separate camps with a rushing creek between them. One was for the pork eaters, the men who headed back to Montreal before autumn. The other was for the Hivernants, the men who wintered in company outposts to the north. "Why two camps? Don't they talk to each other?" Pierre asked. Charbonneau laughed. Pierre was amazed at how relaxed the man was this afternoon. "They talk just fine," he answered. "The problem is their talk always leads to fighting. Hivernants like to boast, and the worst of the whole lot are the Athabascans. The company keeps them apart so they don't kill each other." Pierre nodded. His father had told many stories about Athabascans, that company of voyageurs who were legendary for their strength and endurance. Their standard packs were 110 pounds, and they were hired for 5-year terms. They bragged constantly and liked to prove their toughness in fights with the other voyageurs. Up the hill behind the fort, Charbonneau stopped and announced grandly, "Here it is, the carry that everyone talks about, the Grand Portage itself." Pierre looked up the nearly vertical path. "One day," Charbonneau continued, "you'll be proud to tell your grandchildren you stood here. Fort Charlotte and the Pigeon River are 9 miles off, but what makes the trip so brutal isn't the distance. There's a 300-foot rise between here and there. The company tried horses and mules, but they decided it was cheaper to make men lame." Pierre imagined the agony of such a carry and was glad to be a mere pork eater. The toughest portage on the Ottawa was nothing compared to this. The Hivernants had good reason to brag. Charbonneau led Pierre towards a maze of birch bark wigwams. "Let me introduce you to a few of my friends," he said, grinning like a man who'd been too long absent from home. As they approached the edge of the Indian encampment, two men were wedging a long sheet of sawn birch bark between two rows of stakes that followed the rough outline of a north canoe. One of the men nodded to Charbonneau, but both kept working. Stones were piled on top of the bark sheeting to help form the hull. The men were getting ready to lash the gunwales to the top of the bark with cedar root lacing. "Next, they'll fix the ribs in place," Charbonneau explained, "and then the thwarts and the seats." "That's all there is to it?" Pierre asked. "Just a few days drying and she'll be ready to cock." Pierre looked at the graceful lines of the hull. He guessed the finished craft would be around 25 feet long. "Are the north canoes faster than a Montreal?" Pierre asked. "Not only faster, but easier to portage and maneuver. The Ojibwe have been perfecting these boats for centuries. You can run white water that would stay in a lake canoe." Charbonneau was tracing the curve of the hull as he spoke. "Why, I remember one day when we were running the Namakan River, suddenly there was a war whoop behind him. Pierre whirled to see a tall Indian smothering Charbonneau in his arms. At first, Pierre thought his companion was being attacked, but then he saw Charbonneau grin. As he squeezed Charbonneau tight, the Indian sang out, 'Charbonneau, you old bone shaker!' They pushed each other back to arm's length, and Charbonneau had a chance to speak. "So, how was your winter, Muckwa?" Pierre had never seen anything like Muckwa. To keep from laughing, Pierre covered his open mouth with his hand. The brave wore a wide-brimmed hat with a sash wrapped around the crown, holding 3 ostrich feathers high above his head. A silk handkerchief was tied at his throat, and a red checkered shirt showed beneath his blue waistcoat. Lace was pinned to the shoulders and sleeves of the coat, and he wore dark burgundy knee breeches. Though he didn't wear shoes, Pierre noticed a gray sock on one foot and a red one on the other, each held up by a silk garter. "You know, the winters, my friend," Muckwa replied. "The game goes a little farther out each year, but we survive." The Indian spoke excellent French. He grabbed Charbonneau by the shoulders again. "It is good to see you, Charbonneau." They squatted on the ground and visited a while, sharing news of the past year. After Charbonneau explained Lalonde's death, he said, "We better get back to the fort and report in." "I understand," Muckwa said, "but you must promise to feast with us before you leave this place." "I'd be flattered." "We will talk of old times," he said, "and bring your little friend. He can meet my daughter, Kaniwa." Now off with you." As soon as they were out of earshot, Pierre showed his anger at being called a little friend. "Where did he ever get an outfit like that one?" he sneered. "He's the chief and he wears what he wants." "A chief called Mukwa?" "Mukwa means bear in Ojibwe," Charbonneau explained patiently. "The bear is a powerful spirit. As a member of the Bear Clan, he could tell you many stories, but according to custom, winter's the only season to share the old legends." He stopped. Since Lalanne's death, Charbonneau's gruff, military manner had softened, and Pierre appreciated the way he often went out of his way to explain things. "But I always thought Indian chiefs wore headdresses and buffalo robes," Pierre said. "Mukwa wears what his people regard as the finest dress of the civilized world. Bright clothes are a sign of wealth. The traders encourage it too. They're always willing to swap a bit of lace or a handkerchief for pelts, so the chief gets a bit gaudier every year." "Do all of the chiefs dress like that?" "No," Charbonneau chuckled as he replied, "though you do run into a showy fellow now and then. Farther inland, the Indians dress as they always have. The men wear breech clouts, beaded leggings, and moccasins. The women—" he paused for the slightest moment. "The women wear the softest doeskin shifts you can ever imagine. They're all decorated with tiny beads and colored grasses and quills. In winter, they wear rabbit-skin robes." Charbonneau looked at Pierre's intent face. "We'd better check in with McKay before he decides we'd run off to parts unknown." As they made their way back down the rocky side hill, Pierre tried to picture an inland village such as Charbonneau described. The dark-eyed women in their beaded doeskin dresses sounded like perfect visions from a dream. As they neared the stockade, Pierre saw the Grand Portage had come alive. Though only 24 men had greeted them that morning, there seemed to be 1,000 people milling around the stockade now. Charbonneau scoffed. "Looks like the rascals have crawled out of bed. All it takes is a scent of rum to rouse them." That night, a magnificent banquet was held in the great hall. Traders, clerks, and interpreters crowded along plank tables heaped with honey-glazed ham, venison, smoked trout, bread and butter, peas, Indian corn, potatoes, and fresh milk. Mr. McKay and the other Northwest Company officials sat at a head table, but, except for some fancy bottles of wine, their fare was no better than any of the men from the brigade. 6 weeks of corn and salt pork had left Pierre ravenous for real food. Of all the elegant dishes placed before him, he savored the garden peas and milk most of all. He'd scorned vegetables back home, but the sweet, buttery flavor of the fresh-picked peas stirred his senses to a level of delight only surpassed by the thick, cream-topped mug of milk. When his belly was full, Pierre sat back, and a picture of contentment. From across the table, Emile gave him a broad grin and said, "Do you suppose we could get Bellegarde to stop by the kitchen for lessons?" "They'd throw him out on his ear," Pierre said, chuckling. "Or at least make him take a bath first," Emile added. As soon as the meal was over, Pierre was surprised to see the men carrying the tables to the far end of the room. A bagpipe, fiddle, and flute appeared, and just as the music started, some young Indian women showed up at the door. Dressed in their Sunday best, the men picked out partners and bowed. Beloit, being slower than his mates to notice the women, nearly trampled 2 fellows en route to the door. Displaying a cavalier spirit, he dropped to one knee before the lady of his liking. Pierre watched with pity, imagining the horror that would fill the girl's eyes when Beloit lifted his scarred face. "Watch this," Pierre whispered to Charbonneau. "That girl will scream for sure when he sees his ugly mug." To Pierre's surprise, the pretty girl smiled and nudged the friend beside her. When Beloit offered his arm, he had his chosen promenade proudly to the dance floor. "Did you see that?" Pierre was shocked. "What? Beloit and the girl?" "Yes, she's so pretty, and he's—" "An awful mess?" Charbonneau offered, chuckling at Pierre's astonishment. "It's a different world up here. Scars are a fact of life in the wilderness. They're badges of honor, tokens of a life lived hard and well." Pierre was still shaking his head in disbelief when he felt someone tap his shoulder. He turned to see a pretty Indian girl standing beside him. When she said something in Ojibwe, Charbonneau burst out laughing. "What did she say?" Pierre asked, embarrassed by the sudden attention. She says she wants to dance with the handsome young Frenchman. Charbonneau translated. Apparently all the young girls are talking about you. They like your blonde hair and your big muscles. I thought you were an honest steersman, Pierre said. That's what the lady said. Are you serious? Believe what you want, Charbonneau replied, but be polite. She's waiting for an answer. Pierre was flustered. Tell her that I don't know how to dance. Charbonneau grinned. He turned to the girl and spoke. When he finished, she took Pierre's hand and led him onto the floor. Pierre glared back at Charbonneau, who grinned innocently. Don't look at me, he said. I only told her that you love dancing even more than paddling your canoe. He laughed. Then as Pierre disappeared among the whirling men and women,